Hi, welcome to Get Lit. My name's Pete Crooks. I'm senior editor and senior writer at Diablo Magazine in Walnut Creek. We're here at the beautiful new Walnut Creek Public Library. On Get Lit, we talk with local authors and writers about their craft and about their love of libraries. And we have a very special guest in the library studio today, Gary Bogue, longtime columnist for the Contra Costa Times. Welcome back, Gary.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Great to see you. So, first of all, I've been reading your columns since as long as I can remember. How long have you been writing your column for the Contra Costa Times?
Oh boy, 42 years this year, January 1970.
So 42 years you've had this voice in the local media, and you know, you're beloved by readers, but for those of the viewers who are hearing about your column for the first time, can you briefly explain what you've been writing about for 42 years?
Well, pets, wild animals, the environment. It's sort of a cross between Dear Abby and just talking about everything that suits my fancy.
And you've lived here in the East Bay for how long?
Oh boy, since I was in high school. I was in the second graduating class at Pleasant Hill High School, which was kind of cool.
And you were on the ground level of the Lindsay Wildlife Museum, which has become just a spectacular institution.
It's an incredible place.
You've seen it from the very start. Can you talk a little bit about the Lindsay Wildlife?
I went to work there in 1967. I was driving by one day and I saw this old pump house building in Larkey Park in Walnut Creek, and they were putting up a sign that said Alexander Lindsay Junior Museum, which is what it was called back then. And so I wandered in, and this man who was actually Sam Smoker, who had just been hired as the director a month earlier, said, "Well, what do you think?" And I had collected snakes and lizards, and I had walked in there and the cages were kind of grungy, and I said, "Well, not really impressed." And next thing I knew, he'd con me into coming in on weekends to fix up the cages. And that was in November, and in January they offered me the curator job.
So that was just a happy accident. You
happy accident. It's the best thing that ever happened to me in my whole life. I'd never be doing what I'm doing today.
A huge
without that accident.
Life change. What can you tell us about Alexander Lindsay Jr.?
Well, he was a really cool person who used to have all sorts of interesting animal-related stuff in his garage, and in his spare time he would take animals to local schools and talk in the classrooms and stuff. And he passed away, and all of his friends in the community got together and decided they'd start a museum in his honor. And the original museum was in Larkey Park at the old East Bay Mud Pump House, which they rented for $1 a year. And it grew from that into what you see today is this incredible natural history museum in Larkey Park, the Lindsay Wildlife Museum.
And the Lindsay Wildlife Museum has fantastic exhibitions, but also interactive content for children and families to come in.
Basically, it teaches you what lives in your backyard. And when I started, we just had a few animals that had been around for forever, and it gradually grew. People started bringing us injured birds they'd find, and out of that, we turned it into the Wildlife Rescue Program. I started that program back in '67, and it grew rapidly. I think we were at one time treating 5,000 or 6,000 animals a year. Everything that we were the first one in the country that did that, and the Fish and Wildlife Service would fly in bald eagles that got shot in Nevada, and I'd be at home eating dinner, and there'd be a knock on the door, and I'd open the door, and there'd be a game warden with a baby bear in his hand,
Wow.
And it was insane.
There should be a TV show about that, all the heroic rescues of
it was amazing.
Bald eagles by snipers and whatnot.
You got it.
And that has directly led to your writing career as a author of children's books and books for families to read together about the animals in our backyard.
Right.
Can you talk about how that started?
Well, that started. All the years I've been writing this column, I'd get more and more emails and letters from people about new and different animals, from raccoons to skunks to opossums they see in their backyards. And so I coined the phrase the urban wilderness, which the definition is your backyard. And Chuck Todd, who is the graphics editor and who at the Times, and who is the artist who works on the children's books with me, he and I got together 6 or 7 years ago, and we put out a series. They gave us the whole back page of the A section of the Times on Sunday. And we put together a big, colorful, poster-sized thing. One was mammals of the Bay Area, and another one was raptors of the Bay Area. And we put all those together. And Malcolm Margolin, who is the publisher of Heyday Books in Berkeley, was going up at UC Berkeley to give a talk, and he walked down the hall and there was a teacher's office, and one of these things was torn out and stuck on a bulletin board. So he grabs it and he calls me on the phone and he says, "Would you guys be interested in doing a book?" And after I picked myself up off the floor, because like most authors I had nothing but reject slips, you know, that started
and here's a publisher coming to you, and an East Bay publisher, so the publisher's right in the backyard
that started it.
And which books have you published so far?
We published a book called The Raccoon Next Door, which is all about how to get along with the animals in your backyard. And then we published a book, There's an Opossum in My Backyard. And then we published another one, There's a Hummingbird in My Backyard. And we're working on one called There's a Skunk in My Backyard. Malcolm had said, "Why don't you do a series of children's books?" And he said, well, I said, "How many of them?" And he says, "Well, how many animals are there?"
Wow.
So that's what we're doing.
You've got an endless well to dip into there.
Yeah.
The skunk is an interest. I love skunks. I think they're beautiful creatures. I think they're fun to watch. But you know, everybody has such an apprehension about them because there's that threat of you know, of
a hint of mint.
Yeah. What are the misunderstandings of skunks? What can you tell us about the personality of skunks?
Well, skunks do spray, and it stinks. It only takes a few parts per million, and you can smell it a block away. But they're actually very mild-mannered creatures. And unless you're a dog that runs up yipping at them, you're going to get it in the face. They're pretty laid back. I have a large backyard where my wife and I garden in Benicia. And there used to be a hole under one fence, and I kept covering it, and it kept getting uncovered. And finally I says, well, okay. And I left it, and it turns out there was a skunk using the hole to come in this side, and then he was going out a hole in the other side, and just this was the pathway he wanted. So I'd be out watering, and this skunk would come watering by, and he'd come up and he'd sniff my ankle, and I'd say, "Hi, skunk," and he'd flip his tail at me and walk off. And, and we've gotten along fine. And most people I know and my readers that communicate with me get along fine with them. It's just that anything that comes up yapping at them is gonna get it.
There will be retaliation.
Right.
What is that component that a skunk sprays? What?
I don't know what the scientific name off the top of my head, but it is really potent. I actually have a formula that neutralizes it, and my readers are always writing me to get copies of it to wash their dogs with. And
so you'll hand out the recipe for free if
yeah.
Anybody does get sprayed for a skunk, contact Gary Bogue.
Right.
I am fascinated by your longtime career as a columnist, because I know you have served this community so well, and you've had this dialogue with animal lovers and wildlife lovers in this community for 4 decades.
Yeah.
Let's go back to you didn't have this aspiration to be a journalist.
No, well, you know, it's kind of funny. I was on the high school newspaper.
Okay.
And I took journalism classes, but I also took zoology and biology and stuff, and that was, I liked to write, and I wrote a lot of poetry and stuff like that, but my main interest was wildlife and animals and stuff. And
so you did have the journalism background,
right?
But it wasn't this. You didn't have this driving ambition to be a newspaper columnist as a young person. Let's talk about how the column got started.
We were talking about this before the program.
Right. I think it's very, very interesting.
Well, we needed to get some publicity for the museum. This is back in late '69. And so that's when the Times was on Mount Diablo Boulevard. It was called the Green Sheet at the time. And I went over and I introduced myself, and I had put together some Dear Gary, Dear Abby type letters asking questions about wildlife. And I said, you know, I'd be interested in doing a column, and it'd be good PR for the museum. And we got tons of phone calls, and that might solve our phone call problem. And so they ended up agreeing. They had a tabloid that came out on Fridays called Contra Costa Living, and they'd publish it once a week, and for the enormous price, so they paid me $5 a column, which I thought, wow, I'm a paid columnist, you know. And that lasted about 4 weeks, And then I got a call from Mike DeCal, the editor at the time, who said, you know, gee, I'm sorry, Gary. We just don't have the space, and the ad space and stuff, and we're going to have to cancel it. So I was just crushed, you know. And I went home, and I got to thinking. So I collected all the pens and pencils I had around the house. I went out and bought different kinds, and we had a typewriter. And I wrote dear letters to the editor, you know, what happened to that wonderful columnist you had? And we thought it was so great to learn about the animals around us. And I wrote with my left hand, and I wrote upside down, and my wife wrote letters, and we used different colored pens and sent about 30 letters out. And about 3 or 4 days later, I get a call from them saying, wow, they were astonished that after only a couple of columns we got this response, and they invited me to come back.
Were they getting that kind of overwhelming response from any other column in the paper?
I just
so, and you have no idea if there were any actual letters sent out in your...
I know they were a passel from me.
There were a bunch. And so you were able to convince the editor of the Green Sheet to keep the column going.
Right.
And later you were able to share that story with the founder and publisher of the Contra Costa Times, Dean Lesher.
Yeah, I used to come in. I've always been an early person. My readers know I'm in there to crack of dawn, writing my column. And Dean used to come in real early too, and he'd see me in there, and he'd buy a couple of cups from the coffee machine and sit down, and we'd talk a little bit. He was always very friendly with the staff. And one day I had to tell him. So I told him the story, and he just roared. He had this big, loud barrel laugh. And a couple of weeks later, his secretary called me and said, Dean would like you to go. He's going to give a talk to PG&E or somebody. And I was sitting in the audience, and he told the story and had me stand up, and they gave me a big round of applause. I was really mortified.
Well, it's very charming. Dean Lesher, you know, an iconic figure in publishing and news in this area. Yeah. And we have the Lesher Center for the Arts, which, you know, keeps his legacy going. I have a great relationship with his grandson, Steve Lesher, who started this fantastic speakers series, the Lesher Newsmakers series, which has brought so many, you know, acclaimed and world-famous speakers to Walnut Creek to, you know, to share their stories, to interact with this community. So that Lesher legacy is, you know, very strong to this day. But, you know, I never got to meet Dean Lesher. What can you tell us about him as a person?
He was a neat guy. I liked him a lot. And I had to attend a lot of meetings, and he was at the meetings. And he came in our regular Saturday morning meetings. He would stop by and chat just about every Saturday morning when I was in there working on my column. And I got to know him really well. He was a great publisher. He never messed around in the newsroom and came down and dictate anything or anything. He kept his hands off the news and kept his input on the editorial page, which is what publishers do.
Should do, yeah.
Yeah.
So he was very involved in the culture of the Contra Costa Times.
Of the Times and the culture and in the community. He did a lot of stuff in the community.
Do you have any, you know, special memories of you know, personal interactions you had with him other than the?
Well, actually, he used to take me with him, and when he was giving talks, and had me talk about animals and stuff. He knew how popular the column was becoming, and I would go occasionally with him when he was giving a talk to PG&E or something like that. And I was kind of the comic warm-up, I guess.
Well, people love animals, and and clearly,
I do know one really cool story. There was I did a joke in my column, and it involved a phone number, and I can't remember the exact way the joke went, but it said, you know, if you think this is really funny, call 935-066-Z or something like that, and there's no Z on the phone. Well, so what people did is they went in and they called around that, figuring it was a misspelling. And this poor old gal in Lafayette ended up getting 20 or 30 phone calls because of the little ho-ho joke I did.
Oops.
You did it, the oops joke in my column. And so Dean calls me down. He says, Gary, I sent her a dozen roses. I just wanted you to know it'll be taken out of your check.
That's great. And that goes to show the reaction that journalists do get. Sometimes you don't get a call sometimes you don't get an email, but your column does make a difference in people's lives.
You have to really be careful, yeah.
And so even something like that was an offhanded joke, somebody was, their phone was ringing off the hook unexpectedly. Let's talk a bit about this relationship you have with your readers. You were saying that you've been communicating with some of these people via letters, phone calls, or emails for decades, and then sometimes you'll finally meet in person in the most unexpected situation.
I've got some people for 20 plus years that we communicate 2 or 3 times a week via email, and we've never met face to face. And then I give a lot of talks during the year to garden clubs and business clubs, and every so often somebody will come up and introduce themselves, and then we'll hug each other because we've been good friends for years, but have never actually met face to face.
That's nice.
It's kind of cool. I try to write my columns as if I was writing to the individual who's reading the columns. Try to make them as personal as that.
Do you have a picture in your mind of who you're writing to? Because the individual could be an elderly man, or it could be a young, a second grade girl.
It's just whoever's
reading.
Whoever's reading it, yeah. And I do get the elderly man and the second grade girl.
So 40 years ago when you started your column, your readers would read it in the newspaper, and they'd react by sitting down and taking out a pen and paper or their typewriter and typing up a letter, putting a stamp on it, dropping it in the mail. 3 days later, you receive the letter.
If we're lucky.
If we're lucky. Several days later, the letter could run in the newspaper with a response. Can you talk about how technology has, advanced everything?
Yeah, technology has actually been a real boon for a columnist, because with email, I will be getting, it's common to get responses back the same day that the paper publishes the column. And in fact, I get overwhelming responses if it's a particular subject. Sometimes I'll get as many as 200 email in one day, which is, as you, I'm sure, are well aware, is the good and the bad of email all rolled up into one.
Mm-hmm.
It's great to get that kind of response. It's impossible.
It's impossible to react to it.
I practice triage. I read through to see if there's any emergency, because a lot of times people will ask me questions, that a veterinarian should be asking.
Sure.
I need to contact them and get them going in that direction. So.
You obviously, to be a journalist, you have to be a team player. To work with rescue animals, that requires incredible team effort. So who are your go-to heroes in the community who don't always
I have a huge list of resources. Of course, a lot of the people at Lindsay, I'm also always referring to them, finding out who they're dealing with at the time. I deal with people with the Mount Diablo Audubon. I deal with people at Tony LaRussa's ARF, including Tony sometimes. He's knows a heck of a lot, almost as much about animals as he knows about baseball. Mm-hmm.
Tony LaRussa's Animal Rescue Foundation is similar to the Lindsay Wildlife Museum.
For domestics.
For domestics, but similar in my experience in that it's something to be so proud of that grew up in this community, that started.
Walnut Creek has an amazing situation here. Is they have one of the top wildlife and one of the top domestic animal rescue groups in the area. Although they're not the only animal rescue group domestic in the area. There's Community Concern for Cats, there's the Contra Costa Humane Society, there's probably 10 or 15 domestic animal rescue groups just in Contra Costa County. And
ARF would want to have the viewers know about all of those.
Oh yeah, no, they all interact. They work, in fact, with the economy where it's at and donations down, they interact a lot more lately.
That's interesting.
They try to help each other.
But my point is that this is really something to be proud of in the community, to see the kind of philanthropic effort that, starting with Elaine LaRussa watching the A's game and seeing this little loose kitten running around on the field and saying, and Evie was the cat. And everybody, in the moment thought this was very comical that the cat intervened in the game and delayed the game. And Elaine LaRussa is saying, what's going to happen to that cat?
Right.
And that incident was this tipping point, as in the Malcolm Gladwell, idea that one moment can shift and make a change for better or for worse. And in this case, that created, the rescue of that animal, which led to the conversation about starting ARF. And you were in on those conversations from the very early stages.
Within a couple of days after that animal, the switchboard operator called me and said, "There's a Mr. LaRussa here to see you." Of course, I was not a baseball guy at that time. So I went out, and it was Tony and Elaine. We went back into my office, and we sat down and spent 2 hours where they basically wanted to know how to start an animal rescue group. And they said, "What do you think?" And I said, "You're nuts." Half joking.
Yeah.
Anyway, that ended up in probably 2 or 3 meetings. And then they went and started it. And I actually, at one point in about 1990, I spent 6 months as the director of ARF.
Oh, wow.
And then moved on. It was not my thing.
22 years ago.
Yeah.
And in those, in those 2+ decades, they've rescued countless dogs and cats, but also the programs, the evolution of ARF has led to these community interactive programs where they're taking pets to convalescent homes, so seniors who are in, fairly invalid situations are able to get that affection that comes from.
And actually providing pets for some convalescent hospitals will allow pets to be there, sort of the group
residents.
Pet.
Wow.
The resident pet, and they provided animals there. They also have classes for teaching people how to train your pets, your dogs.
They also have classes where pets are kind of introduced to at-risk teens who are in situations in their lives where they may be looking at a very kind of cynical and bleak young adulthood, and that communication that people have with animals is different than that we have with our parents or our peers.
Right.
There's a different relationship between a human and an animal. And
well, these kids actually, they have a program where they come and work there as volunteers, and it really helps.
It's making a huge difference.
It's kind of a neutral party that they can work with without getting defensive, and can go from there.
It's amazing
it's a neat program.
What ARF has done. And not to just highlight that, as you said, there are so many humane societies and animal rescue.
Right. Well, it's like Community Concern for Cats. They just deal with ferals.
Feral cats.
So there's a lot of specialties going on,
What do you think, as you said, the economy has been tough. What are the biggest needs for those animal resources here in the East Bay?
Right now, money. In fact, all the time people are email me or they'll phone me and they'll say, I have some money I'd like to donate to an animal rescue group, and should it be Humane Society of the United States, which is a good group, or Defenders of Wildlife and stuff. And I say, well, those are all big, fancy, excellent groups, but I say, if you want my recommendation, help local. Help a local group, and there are many. And
it'll make a difference.
Sure.
Also in the East Bay, we have these incredible access to open space parks where you can be in the wilderness. You can really get away from, the 680 traffic jam in a short amount of time. Where do you like to go experience the wilderness in the East Bay?
I like Mount Diablo. That's always
That's
great.
a good one.
And there are various Fernandez and Martinez. Fernandez Ranch, the Muir Heritage Land Trust runs that. We're lucky to have some really top land trusts in the area.
That Muir Heritage Land Trust has opened up incredible amounts of open space that just have, spectacular views of the bays, and there are now hiking trails where you can see expanses of open space that were just not available to public
And they
viewing.
had people who are experts in local ecology go in and put those trails in so they can take you to see what's there without impacting the local wildlife, which is very important. I also like to go to the East Bay Regional Park District, which is probably one of the top park districts in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely.
They have such special places. And all the communities around the Bay Area have got a nearby regional park.
For dog lovers, we have 2 dogs at home. What are your favorite places to take dogs, and are there places that have acceptable off-leash areas?
Yes, there are. There's right above Tilted Park, right at Wildcat Canyon Road, where just before it dips down into where the reservoir is, San Pablo Reservoir. There's a fire trail that goes along there. It's part of the Tilden Park area, and you can take dogs off leash there. Thing to do is to go to the East Bay Regional Park website, and they have all of the parks listed there, and they have them all listed, those where you have to keep them on leash or where you can take them off the leash.
So search for that
And,
East Bay Regional.
Point Richmond.
Point
is
Richmond.
Another good dog
Point
park.
Isabel. Is that?
Point Isabel is very popular.
Yeah, that's a
with dog
great
people.
social scene for
Oh
dog
yeah,
lovers.
it is.
And there's
The dogs interact and the owners interact.
there's a
Yeah,
cafe
it's
there,
cool.
so the owners can get their cappuccinos,
Yeah.
and there's a little pet store there and a grooming center and everything. It's quite a scene, and again, spectacular views of the bay right across at San Francisco. Gary, you've been such a hero of this community. I thank you so much for coming in. The column, the books, and the interaction with the community. Is there one thing that stands out as your favorite achievement of this great journalistic career that you've had?
Being able to help the open space groups. I periodically will do fundraisers through my column for them, and my readers respond incredibly. And to be able to help something like that, that's special.
You know you're making a difference.
Yeah.
And so looking back, when you faked all those letters that said, you got to keep this guy Gary Bogue on, are you glad you did it?
Yeah, I am.
I think
It was kind of cheating, but cheating for a good cause is not always bad.
I'm glad you did too. Well, Gary Bogue, thanks again. I've been a fan of yours for so long. It's always such a pleasure to speak with you, so thanks for coming in to Get Lit. And thank you for watching. Make sure to tune in to Get Lit. Here at the Walnut Creek Library, we'll be meeting all sorts of interesting authors, and we'll see you here on the show, and we'll also see you here at the Walnut Creek Public Library. Thanks for watching.